They killed for the badge. Then the badge turned and killed them. One club dragged an entire Canadian province into an 8-year war, more than 160 dead, 2 prison guards, and an 11-year-old boy. These are the men who ran it. 1. Yves Buteau. Everything that followed the wars, the massacres, the bodies in the St. Lawrence, none of it exists without one ceremony on the 5th of December, 1977. On that day, in Montreal, a violent outlaw gang called the Popeyes burned their old patches and pulled on new ones, red and white, a death's head, the words Hell's Angels across the top. Canada had its first Hell's Angels chapter, and the colors were handed over personally by Sonny Barger, the man who built the Angels in America. The Canadian who made it happen was Yves Buteau. They called him Le Boss. Buteau was born in Montreal in 1951 and rose to lead the Popeyes, the most feared outlaw club in Quebec. Unlike the brawlers around him, he was thinking bigger than a street gang. He wanted to plug into the most powerful criminal motorcycle brand on earth, but the price of admission was blood. The Angels had originally eyed a rival Montreal club, the Devil's Disciples, as their way into Canada, so the Popeyes simply destroyed them first, killing some 15 members in a war they started and won. The man who wiped out the Angels' preferred partner became the Angels' first Canadian president instead. It was the most ruthless job application in Canadian criminal history, and it worked. And what he built the club into was genuinely new. Before Buteau, outlaw motorcycle gangs in Quebec were exactly that, gangs, running on beer, bravado, and turf brawls. Buteau grasped that the real money was in narcotics distribution at scale, and that scale required organization, reliable suppliers, disciplined members, clean public faces, and alliances with the men who controlled the ports and the import routes. His partnership with the West End gang plugged the Angels straight into the cocaine, flowing off the ships at the port of Montreal, which was the single richest artery of the Canadian drug trade. He made the Hells Angels not just another gang fighting for a corner, but an indispensable link in the national supply chain, the distribution muscle for the men at the very top. Every dollar the club would later kill over-traced back to the infrastructure Buteau laid in those first 6 years. Then he did the thing that separated him from every beer hall brawler in Quebec. He built an organization. One crime reporter said he took a gang of drunken thugs and turned it into a professional criminal enterprise, ordering members clean-shaven and low-profile, forging a partnership with the Irish West End gang that controlled the drug imports flowing through the port of Montreal, opening chapters across Quebec, then reaching all the way to British Columbia, where, in July 1983, he brought a 3-chapter gang called Satan's Angels into the fold and gave the Hells Angels their first foothold on the West Coast. In the spring of 1982, he handed down the rule that would eventually detonate everything. No member was to use cocaine, on penalty of death. It was ignored, especially by the North chapter in Laval, and that quiet defiance would tear the club apart. And he built the empire while fighting a war for its life. Almost as soon as the Angels landed in Canada, the entrenched outlaws tried to strangle them in the crib. In October 1978, at a Montreal bar called Le Tourbillon, outlaws' gunmen ambushed a group that included Buteau, killing one Angel and wiping out members of a visiting Hamilton club called the Wild Ones, whose sole survivor that night, a scarred little English speaker named Walter Stadnik, weights much higher on this list. Buteau's answer was to send his deadliest assassin after the men responsible, and he kept building through the bloodshed, professionalizing the club into something no Canadian outlaw gang had been before. A disciplined business with a supply chain, a treasury, and a national footprint. He wasn't a brawler who got lucky. He was the architect of the entire structure. Everyone who followed would inherit and abuse. 6 weeks after the BC expansion, the machine killed him. On the 8th of September, 1983, Buteau was shot dead at a bar in the Montreal suburbs by a 22-year-old drug dealer named Gino Goudreau, who claimed self-defense and was acquitted. The founder of the Canadian Hells Angels was dead at 32, killed by a nobody who walked free. His funeral drew 2,000 onlookers and 150 angels, and police found a bomb on the funeral route the next day. But the real damage was the vacuum. With Buteau gone, the discipline he'd imposed rotted almost overnight, the cocaine ban collapsed, and the stage was set for the bloodiest internal purge in the club's history. His death is the first domino. Everyone that follows falls, because he wasn't there to hold the line. Let me say one thing, and then I won't bring it up again. I have gathered everything you could possibly imagine about bikers and hidden secrets into this book. Available at my website, theinvestigator.com. If you want it, it is there. That is all. To David, Gyrator, Giles. On the 25th of August, 2012, a warehouse in Burnaby, British Columbia, was set to receive half a ton of cocaine. The buyers had already paid $4 million in cash and spent months flying to Vancouver, Mexico City, Panama, and Montreal to arrange the deal with what they believed was a South American cartel. On delivery day, the cocaine was fake, the cartel was the RCMP, and the man who carried $4 million into that warehouse was David Giles, founding vice president of the Hells Angels Kelowna chapter and one of the most senior angels in the entire country. Giles came from nothing, born in St. John, New Brunswick, into a brutal childhood, an alcoholic mother who died young, a fifth-grade education, a reformatory notorious for abuse. But somewhere between the Maritimes and the West Coast, he crossed paths with Maurice Boucher in Montreal and built a close personal bond with the most dangerous man in Canadian biker history. That connection pulled him to the top of the national organization and made his small Okanagan chapter matter far beyond its size. It also meant police watched Kelowna from the day it opened. And that tells you how tightly the national network was wired. Kelowna is a small resort city in the British Columbia interior, about as far from Montreal's biker war as you can get and still be in the same country. Yet the vice president of its Hells Angels chapter was a personal associate of the warlord running Quebec, carrying the same weight and drawing the same scrutiny as the killers in the East. That was the machine men like Stadnik built, a structure where a man in the wine country of the Okanagan answered into the same organization as the bombers of Montreal. Giles wasn't a local operator who got lucky. He was a senior officer in a national corporation with the credentials and the enemies to prove it, and for most of his career, he wore that status like armor. For years, Giles beat them. In 2008, after 72 court appearances, he was acquitted in a sprawling RCMP investigation, and that acquittal collapsed the Crown's entire bid to have the Hells Angels declared a criminal organization in British Columbia, a designation that would have unlocked mass asset seizures across every chapter. In a single verdict, David Giles personally shielded the whole BC operation from the most dangerous legal weapon the state had, and it made him untouchable in his own mind. That was the trap. A man who beats the system that many times stops believing the system can win and stops watching for the one play he hasn't seen. The RCMP understood that better than he did. They didn't try to out-lawyer him again. They built a fantasy, a fake cartel, fake couriers, fake product, a months-long courtship across 4 countries, designed to appeal to exactly the ambition a confident senior boss would have, and they let Giles talk himself into the deal, one recorded conversation at a time. That was the flaw the RCMP exploited. In the 2012 sting, Giles, by his own recorded words, treated the deal as his ticket to becoming his organization's cocaine distributor. He complained the product from the United States was too weak, bragged about his market, and in a Panama City restaurant flashed his Hells Angels tattoos to a man he thought was a drug lord. The judge later called him a full and equal partner in the conspiracy. What he actually received in the warehouse was 199 kilos of fake cocaine and 1 real kilo packed with a tracker. In 2017, 66, and in failing health, he was sentenced to 18 years, the longest ever handed to a British Columbia Hells Angel. He died in an Abbotsford hospital 3 months later. The longest sentence in the province's biker history was served for exactly 3 months before his body gave out. And the damage didn't stop with him. The recordings from that warehouse sting became evidence in a separate government effort to seize the Hells Angels clubhouses in Kelowna, Nanaimo, and East Vancouver, with the state arguing the very buildings would be used to commit future crimes. The man who had once single-handedly saved the club from being branded a criminal organization ended his life as the reason the state came for its clubhouses. There is a brutal symmetry in it. Giles proved both truths about this world at once. that a smart, disciplined operator could beat the system for years, and that the system, when it finally decided to spend the money and the patience, could build an entire fake cartel around a real man and walk him into a warehouse carrying $4 million in cash money he handed, with a handshake, straight to the police. 3. Danny Kane. On the 7th of August, 2000, Danny Kane was found dead in his car in the garage of his home south of Montreal, carbon monoxide, ruled suicide, 31 years old. And the man who had done more than anyone alive to bring down Maurice Boucher and the most powerful Hells Angels operation in the country was gone. 7 months before the raids, his information made possible, before he could ever take the witness stand. Kane was 2 men at once, every day, for years. He joined the Rockers, the Hells Angels' dedicated enforcement arm, the crew that did the killing during the biker war, and he was good at it, reliable, trusted, exactly the kind of man that world rewards. He was also, secretly, bisexual, with a male lover inside the same gang. And, in 1994, while building his reputation as an enforcer, he made the decision that would define and destroy him. He became a paid informant for the RCMP. That detail, a bisexual man hiding a relationship inside one of the most aggressively macho subcultures on Earth, is its own kind of danger, layered on top of the espionage, and it eventually became the thread that nearly unraveled him. When his lover was arrested and turned, that same man told investigators about Kane's crimes, and for a time, the relationship that had been a secret became a liability that even his police handlers couldn't manage. Kane was living 3 lives at once: the trusted angel, the police informant, and the hidden partner, each one a death sentence in that world if the wrong person found out. The wonder is not that he came apart, the wonder is that he held all 3 together for as long as he did. Understand the tightrope. The Hells Angels do not merely dislike informants, they hunt them, torture them, make examples of them. It is the one unforgivable crime. Kane committed it every single day, from inside the enforcement arm, surrounded by the men who would have executed him on the spot. By day, he committed crimes for the Angels, involved in murders between 1994, 1997, 997, supplying explosives for others. By night, he reported it all to his handlers, source number 3683, wearing wires into meetings, photocopying the club's documents, mapping the chain of command from the Rockers up through the elite nomads to Boucher himself. When a Montreal police commander needed to know which killings to re-examine, he used Kane's information to build the suspect list, and a fresh forensic review of those exact murders turned up new DNA that tied specific angels to specific bodies. There has never been a more valuable or more tortured informant in Canadian history. No one had ever penetrated the Hells Angels at that depth, because it was supposed to be impossible to survive an informant inside the enforcement arm, trusted with the club's darkest work, is a dead man the instant a single detail slips. Kane held that impossible position for 6 years, committing real murders to maintain his cover while feeding the police the evidence to convict the men beside him. He was, simultaneously, one of the club's killers and the single greatest threat to its existence, and the psychological cost of living both lives at once is written all over the note he left behind. But the pressure was inhuman. At one point, his own lover, arrested and flipped, told investigators Kane had committed murders, and the RCMP cut contact for 2 years before crawling back, because what he offered was irreplaceable. He left a note that reads like a man coming apart, asking who he even was, a biker or a policeman, good or evil, the exploited or the exploiter. He never got to answer it. The official cause was suicide, but his family said his face looked badly beaten, and whether Danny Kane killed himself or was finally discovered has never been resolved. What is certain is that his death, 7 months before the Great Raids, served the Hells Angels perfectly, and in that world, outcomes that convenient rarely happen by accident. And the raids his work made possible were historic. When Operation Springtime finally came down in the spring of 2001, it swept up more than 100 Hells Angels and associates across the country in a single coordinated strike, the largest assault on an outlaw motorcycle gang in Canadian history. The Crown had reportedly offered Kane well over $1 million to do what he did: wear the wire, copy the documents, sit through the meetings, and hand police the map of an organization no outsider had ever penetrated at that level. He was the most valuable inside source Canadian law enforcement had ever placed inside the Angels, and also a murderer who kept killing while he informed, which made him a nightmare of a witness even alive. But his greatest value was never going to be his testimony. It was the trail of evidence he left behind, the lists, the documents, the leads that pointed investigators at exactly the right bodies. He built the case that broke the club, and then he was gone before it ever reached a courtroom. 4. David, Wolf, Carroll. Some of the men on this list died in prison or in the street. This one simply vanished, and more than 2 decades later, he is still gone. David Wolf Carroll is one of the reasons the Hells Angels grew as vicious as they did in Canada, and one of the most wanted fugitives the country has ever produced. Carroll came up through the Halifax chapter, giving the Angels their maritime foothold, and in early 1985, he lit the fuse on the massacre that defined Canadian biker history. The story is almost petty in its origins. Carroll had paid the club's top assassin, Yves Trudeau, $98,000 for a contract killing. The North chapter in Laval was entitled to a quarter of that money, but Trudeau, a member of that very chapter, had blown it all up his nose on cocaine. To Carroll and the club's leadership, it was proof the North chapter had become a drug-addled liability that was stealing from its own. Carroll went to Montreal, sat down with the president of the South chapter, and demanded action. Days later, 5 men were dead. Carroll was charged over the massacre and, in 1987, acquitted of first-degree murder, the first of many times. The system reached for him and came away empty. He rose into the Nomads, the elite chapter Boucher, built to run the Quebec drug war, and became one of its most feared members, eventually wanted in connection with more than a dozen murders and convicted of drug trafficking, assault, and firearms offenses. Then, in the spring of 2001, when Operation Springtime swept up more than 100 Angels in the largest anti-biker raid in Canadian history, David Carroll was not among them. He was already gone. To sit in the Nomads during the biker war was to sit at the operational heart of the killing. This was the chapter that planned the hits, moved the drugs, and directed the enforcement arms that turned Montreal into a battlefield, and Carroll was one of its senior, most trusted figures, a man who had already proven, at Lennoxville, that he could help engineer the deaths of his own brothers without flinching. Whatever he did during those years, the state believed it added up to a role in more than a dozen murders. He was not a bystander who got nervous and ran. He was a core member of the most dangerous criminal cell in the country, who understood the machine well enough to know exactly when to disappear. He has never been found. Investigators believe he fled through a string of countries: the United States, Mexico, Brazil, elsewhere in South America, Europe, and as far as New Zealand and Australia, always a step ahead, always vanishing before the net closed. Decades on, he remains a wanted man, one of the ghosts of the Canadian Hells Angels, a founding architect of its bloodiest purge, who was never made to answer for any of it, still out there somewhere, still free. Think about what his disappearance represents. Every other senior figure from Boucher's war was accounted for killed, convicted, or turned. Carroll simply stepped off the board and stayed off it, and no amount of international police cooperation has closed the gap since. He is the proof that even at the height of the largest anti-biker operation in the country's history, a man who knew where the bodies were buried could see it coming and walk away clean. Somewhere, an old outlaw who helped plan the murder of 5 of his own brothers is living out his years under another name, and the Canadian justice system that took down almost everyone around him has spent more than 2 decades unable to put a hand on his shoulder. In a story full of men destroyed by the machine they served, Carroll is the one who beat it, not by winning, but by disappearing. 5. Réjean Zigzag Lessard. If Carroll lit the fuse, this is the man who gave the order and turned a business dispute into the single most infamous act of violence in the history of the Canadian Hells Angels. On the 24th of March, 1985, 5 members of the club's own North chapter were lured to a clubhouse in Lennoxville, near Sherbrooke, for what they thought was a party. Men with machine guns were waiting. The man who planned it was Réjean Lessard. They called him Zigzag. Lessard was born in 1955 into a middle-class family in Quebec's eastern townships. a rebellious teenager who rejected everything his bourgeois upbringing stood for and drifted into the biker world through a small gang, before rising to president of the Angels' powerful South chapter in Sorel. And Lessard was not a simple thug. He was an ideologue, a true believer in the discipline and survival of the club above every individual in it. When Carroll came to him raging about the North chapter blowing profits and snorting the product they were supposed to sell, Lessard needed little encouragement. He had already decided the Laval chapter was a menace to the very existence of the Angels in Quebec, so he made an institutional decision that most people cannot comprehend. The chapter would not be disciplined, it would be exterminated. The 5 men were shot dead as they arrived, including the North chapter's president, Laurent Langlais-Viau, a founding member of the Canadian Hells Angels. As one victim lay dying, a South chapter man stood over him and delivered the club's only epitaph. "You sniffed too much." The bodies were zipped into sleeping bags, weighted with iron plates, and dropped into the St. Lawrence River, where divers found them 2 months later. It was cold, total, and utterly without mercy, the club murdering its own brothers to protect the brand. What makes it truly chilling is that it was a decision, not an eruption. Lennoxville wasn't a bar fight that spun out of control or a moment of rage. It was planned, debated, and voted on by men who then invited their brothers to a party specifically to kill them, with roughly 40 angels present as the chapter was liquidated and the evidence cleaned up. One of the men involved even had his own brother among the intended targets. This was an institution, making an institutional choice, weighing a chapter's usefulness against the cost of eliminating it, and choosing elimination. Lessard didn't see 5 men. He saw a liability on a balance sheet, and he zeroed it out. That capacity to reduce human beings, even fellow members, to a line item to be deleted is the exact quality that would define the Hells Angels in Canada for the next 2 decades, and Lennoxville is where it was first put on full display. Lessard was one of only 4 men ever convicted of first-degree murder for Lennoxville, sentenced to life. And the strangest coder of all, in prison, the ideologue who had ordered 5 executions, converted to Buddhism, formally left the Hells Angels in 1989, and decades later was granted parole. But the lesson he burned into the organization outlived his sentence. After Lennoxville, every angel in Canada understood a single terrible truth, that loyalty flowed one way only, upward to the machine, and that the machine would kill anyone, including its own, to survive. Every war that followed was fought by men who had learned that lesson from Zigzag Lessard. There is one more consequence, and it may be the largest of all. The sheer cold-bloodedness of Lennoxville, a chapter luring its own brothers to a party and machine-gunning them horrified, even other criminals, and it convinced a generation of Montreal gangsters that the Hells Angels could never be trusted or joined safely. One of the men who drew exactly that conclusion was Salvatore Cazetta, who would soon build the rock machine specifically to oppose an organization willing to butcher its own. In other words, the massacre Lessard ordered to protect the Angels helped create the single greatest threat they would ever face. The purge meant to guarantee the club's survival, planted the seed of the 8-year war that nearly destroyed it. That is the shadow Zigzag Lessard cast over everything, a man who thought he was saving the Hells Angels, and instead lit the long fuse that would burn for the next 2 decades. 6. Salvatore Cazetta. In the spring of 1994, 2 men who had once been childhood friends were about to go to war, and the war they started would kill more than 160 people. One was Maurice Boucher, the other was Salvatore Cazetta, the only man in Montreal who understood Boucher well enough to know exactly what he was capable of, because they had come up together. Cazetta was born in Montreal around 1954, and in 1976 co-founded a club called the SS, where he met and befriended Boucher. When the Hells Angels came looking to expand, both men were prime candidates, and then they made opposite choices that set the course of Canadian organized crime for 30 years. Boucher joined. Cazetta refused, not from fear, but from judgment. He had watched what the Angels were willing to do to hold power, and he wanted no part of an organization that slaughtered its own. So, in 1986, he built the thing designed to oppose them. The Rock Machine, founded with his brother Giovanni as a deliberate counterweight to Hells Angels' dominance, engineered by the one man who knew Boucher's playbook. And the Rock Machine was serious. The Cazettas spoke French, English, and Italian, and were wired simultaneously into the Risotto Mafia, the Irish West End gang, and the Old Dubois network, sitting at the intersection of the three most powerful criminal forces in Montreal. As the risottos imported through the port, the rock machine distributed. By the early 1990s, it had over 100 members and was, according to police, one of the city's primary cocaine importers. And for years it was untouchable because Boucher would not move against his old friend, and moving on the rock machine meant war with the most powerful crime family in Canada. That position is why Cazetta mattered far beyond bikers. This was not a lone club shaking down bars. It was a bridge between the mafia that ran the port, the Irish gang that controlled the waterfront imports, and the biker network that moved product to the street. Cazetta spoke all their languages, literally and figuratively, and that made the early rock machine genuinely untouchable and made the eventual war catastrophic, because it was never a squabble between two motorcycle clubs. It was a collision between two halves of the entire Montreal underworld, and Cazetta had built one of them from scratch, specifically to survive the other. Then, in 1994, the peace shattered not by a declaration, but by an arrest. Cazetta and a fellow member had flown to Florida with $660,000 to buy cocaine. It was an American sting, and by 1994, he was in a US federal prison. The instant he was caged, the protection his presence provided evaporated, Boucher moved, and the Quebec biker war began. Cazetta spent the entire 8-year war behind bars, powerless, watching the organization he had built to stop the Angels get ground down and absorbed into the Bandidos, then erased. And then he did the one thing no one could have imagined. In 2005, he joined the Hells Angels, and by 2011, police described Salvatore Cazetta as the leader of the Angels in Quebec. The man who built the greatest opposition the Angels ever faced ended up as their boss, and even at the top, he later sued the Quebec government for $2 million over one of his arrests. The ideology died somewhere along the way. The survival instinct never did. And the law never stopped circling him. In June 2009, Cazetta was arrested in a sweep involving some 600 officers moving against dozens of targets across the Montreal area. In November 2015, he was caught up in another major operation, though those charges were eventually dropped over trial delays and the release that prompted his lawsuit against the state. Consider the sheer nerve of it: a lifelong outlaw, a mafia associate, the leader of the Hells Angels in Quebec, suing the government for wrongful arrest from a position of enough power and legitimacy that the claim wasn't laughed out of the room. That is how far Cazetta traveled, from a man so repulsed by the Angels' brutality that he built an army to fight them, to their untouchable figurehead taking the state to court. Of every reversal in this story, none is more complete than the founder of the rock machine ending his career as the Hells Angels' Quebec boss. 7. Gregory Picasso Woolly. For decades, the Hells Angels were, by rule and by culture, a white organization. Gregory Woolly broke that wall, a Haitian-Canadian who rose to the very center of Maurice Boucher's operation and became one of the most feared and most connected enforcers in the country. They called him Picasso, a nickname earned by underworld legend for how young he was when he first killed. Woolly became Boucher's personal bodyguard, his most trusted assassin, and eventually the president of the Rockers, the Angels' enforcement arm, the same crew Danny Kane rode with. But his real significance was as a bridge. Woolly connected the overwhelmingly white Hells Angels to Montreal's black and immigrant street gangs, giving the club a reach into neighborhoods and networks it could never have touched on its own, and later linking the bikers to the Italian mafia as well. In an underworld carved along ethnic lines, he was the rare figure who moved fluidly across all of them, and that made him invaluable and dangerous in a way no ordinary enforcer could be. That he reached that height at all is remarkable, because the Hells Angels were, for most of their history, a rigidly white organization, and the outlaw biker world was hostile ground for a black man. Woolly didn't just survive in it, he made himself indispensable to its most powerful boss, earning a level of trust almost no outsider ever achieved. A police officer who once arrested him and found guns and body armor in his car put it simply: when you're the man trusted to run Maurice Boucher's own operation, you are somebody. Woolly was a man who forced open a door the club had kept shut for decades, purely on the strength of how useful and how feared he had made himself. He was swept up in Operation Springtime with the rest of Boucher's inner circle and did his time, but prison did not end him. After his release, Woolly re-emerged as a power broker in his own right, working to unite Montreal's fractured street gangs and position himself at the crossroads of the biker, gang, and mafia worlds, a man whose diplomacy across the underworld made him more powerful outside the club's formal structure than most members were inside it. He had survived the war, survived the raids, survived prison, and rebuilt. What made him singular is worth dwelling on, because it explains both his power and his death. The Montreal underworld was carved along ethnic and organizational lines that almost never mixed: the white bikers, the Italian mafia, the Haitian and black street gangs, each in its own lane, each suspicious of the others. Woolly was the hinge that connected them. He could sit with the angels and with the street crews and with the mafia and be trusted, or at least tolerated, by all three, which meant deals that could never otherwise happen ran through him. In an underworld built on rigid boundaries, the man who could cross every boundary held a kind of power no single organization could grant. It also made him a permanent target, because a hinge that everyone depends on is a hinge everyone has a reason to remove. Woolly spent his life as the indispensable middleman in a business where the indispensable middleman knows too much, owes too many, and stands in too many lines of fire. He balanced there, brilliantly, for almost 30 years, until the day the balance failed. And then, on the 17th of November, 2023, decades after the Quebec Biker War, it caught up with him. Woolly was shot 7 times in a parking lot near a Montreal area health center, standing beside his white Lamborghini near his partner and their 3-day-old child. The getaway vehicle was found burning nearby within the hour. He was pronounced dead, no one was ever charged, and even the church declined him a funeral. The man who had spent his life as the bridge between worlds died in broad daylight, in front of his newborn, proof that in this world, being the most connected man in the room protects you right up until the moment it doesn't. His killing, decades after the war that made him, is a reminder that the debts these men run up never really expire. Woolly had outlasted almost everyone from Boucher's era, adapted, reinvented himself, and climbed back to the top of a new underworld. None of it mattered in the end. Somewhere in the tangle of alliances he'd spent a lifetime building and rebuilding, someone decided he was worth more dead than alive, and the same fluid world that had made him powerful closed over him without a ripple. No arrests, no funeral, just a burning getaway car and a newborn who will grow up knowing the father only from the story of how he died. 8. Yves Apache Trudeau. Between 1970 and 1985, one man murdered 43 people, not for passion, not for revenge, but for hire a product his organization could rent out to anyone with the right connections and enough cash. He was the first Canadian Hell's Angel to earn the filthy few patch, awarded only to those who kill for the club. The Montreal underworld gave him 2 names that captured both halves of him: Apache for the savagery and the Mad Bomber for the method. His name was Yves Trudeau, and by admitted body count, he is the deadliest assassin in the history of the Canadian Hell's Angels. The skill that defined him came from an ordinary teenage job at a chemical company, where he learned to handle explosives. He joined the Popeyes, became a founding Hell's Angel in 1977, and turned into something no other enforcer in the city was, not just a killer for his own club, but a contract killer the Angels could sell. When the Irish mob or the Dubois brothers needed a rival gone, they called the Angels, and the Angels sent Trudeau. He was a revenue stream, rented out like equipment, his fee running as high as $200,000 a job. 10 of his 43 kills came from bombs he built himself. In one, he delivered a television set packed with explosives to a downtown apartment where 4 men waited for their new entertainment center. When they switched it on, the blast tore out an entire floor and killed all 4. Sent to kill a wayward angel and finding only the man's mother home, he beat her to death. I told he'd once killed the wrong man entirely, an innocent stranger who resembled the target. He said the man deserved it for looking like the mark. Think about what that made him inside the organization. Most enforcers are a cost men you feed, house, and bail out. Trudeau was a profit center. The club pointed him at whoever the market demanded, took its cut, and let him work. And for 15 years, he never failed to deliver. He killed Irish gangsters and rival bikers and mafia targets and debtors and witnesses across the entire spectrum of the Montreal underworld with an efficiency that made him the most feared contract killer in the country. He was not a man who lost his temper and hurt someone. He was a service cold, reliable, and for sale, and the fact that a criminal organization could operate a human being that way, as inventory, tells you exactly what kind of world these men had built. Trudeau belonged to the very North chapter that Lennoxville was designed to exterminate, and he survived the massacre for one reason only. He was locked in a drug rehab clinic the day it happened. When the news reached him, he understood there was a contract on his head, and he did the thing no full-patch Canadian Hells Angel had done before. He talked. He pleaded guilty to 43 counts of manslaughter and became a Crown witness, and the deal, a light sentence, protection, a stipend, caused public fury that lasted for years. His testimony helped solve dozens of murders and convict a string of angels, but he proved so unreliable on the stand that trial after trial collapsed. He served about 7 years, was released in 1994 under a new name, and vanished into an ordinary life, caring for the elderly. And here is the consequence that ripples all the way to the top of this list. Trudeau's sweetheart deal, and the deals that followed for other biker killers who flipped, taught Maurice Boucher a lesson he would act on, with horrifying logic years later. Boucher watched the Crown hand lenient bargains to murderer after murderer in exchange for testimony, and he concluded that the only way to stop it was to commit crimes so brazen, so directly aimed at the justice system, that no prosecutor could ever justify a deal. The public outrage over Apache Trudeau's 7 years didn't just embarrass the state. It planted the idea that would eventually get 2 prison guards murdered on a Montreal street. That is how tightly these men are wound together. The assassin's plea bargain in 1985 becomes the warlord's rationale for declaring war on the government a decade later. Then, in 2004, his name surfaced again, arrested for the sexual assault of a young boy. The judge told him he had killed more people than the Canadian Army had in the Gulf War, that there was in him a definite instinct of evil. He developed cancer, was granted compassionate parole in 2008, and died within weeks. The sister of the innocent man he'd killed by mistake had her own verdict on the cancer that took him. "A guy like that has no soul," she said, "and that cancer is justice." He is, in a strange way, the perfect emblem of this whole story, a man the Hells Angels built into the deadliest weapon in the country, used until he was inconvenient, marked for death the moment he became a liability, and then abandoned to become a broken, despised old man dying of cancer in a cell. The club made him, the club condemned him, and the club moved on without him. 43 lives, and in the end, he mattered to the organization exactly as long as he was useful, and not one day longer. That is the deal every man on this list signed, whether he understood it or not. 9. Walter Nugget Stadnik. While Boucher fought a war in the streets, another man was quietly doing something that would prove even more consequential, and almost nobody outside the club saw it happening. He was 5'4". His face and hands were scarred, and partly fused from a motorcycle fire that should have killed him. He spoke no French, in an organization whose entire power base was French-Canadian. He looked like the least likely biker warlord imaginable. His name was Walter Stadnik, and by the time law enforcement understood what he'd built, it was already built. Stadnik was born in 1952 in Hamilton, Ontario, a steel city choked by 3 mafia families and a hostile outlaws, Chapter 1 of the worst possible places to plant a Hells Angels flag. When the outlaws slaughtered most of his first club, he fled to Montreal and threw in with the Angels, taking his full patch in 1982. In 1984, riding to a memorial for the murdered founder Buteau, a priest speeding to see the Pope slammed into his motorcycle. The bike went up in flames, burning his face and hands and fusing his fingers, which surgeons had to cut apart. Most men would have walked away from a life that had nearly killed them twice. Stadnik healed and went back to work, and in 1988 became the national president of the Hells Angels in Canada, an almost impossible achievement for an English-speaking Hamiltonian in a French Quebec organization. Consider how improbable that ascent really was. He was small, scarred, physically unremarkable, and couldn't even speak the language of the men he was meant to lead. For years he needed another Hamilton biker to translate for him in Montreal. In a subculture that runs on intimidation and machismo, Stadnik had almost none of the obvious raw materials. What he had instead was strategic patience and an organizational mind, and in a club drowning in muscle that turned out to be the rarest and most valuable thing of all. The other angels rose by being the most frightening man in the room. Stadnik rose by being the only one thinking 3 provinces, and 10 years ahead, the man who understood that the real prize was never the next fight, but the map. Here is what made him different. Boucher thought about Quebec. Stadnik thought about Canada. One journalist called him less a biker leader than a corporate chief executive who happened to wear a death's head, and the comparison is exact. He treated rival and independent clubs the way a conglomerate treats acquisition targets, studying them, understanding their markets, and instead of destroying them, absorbing them, folding their members and territory and drug networks into one national brand. A dead rival is a body. An absorbed rival is a distributor. While the war raged in Quebec, Stadnik traveled the country, building the infrastructure to turn a regional gang into a national corporation. Ontario was the prize, and it had been locked against the Angels for years by rival clubs and the old Hamilton Mafia. Then, in 1997, the 2 most powerful mafia figures blocking the door were assassinated within 2 months of each other by a hitman named Ken Murdoch, and whatever the tangle of motives, the old guard that had kept the Angels out was suddenly gone. Rather than fight the remaining clubs, Stadnik made them an offer. Join the most powerful criminal brand on earth or keep competing against it. On the 29th of December, 2000, nearly 200 Ontario bikers patched over in a single coordinated night, the largest mass patchover in Canadian history. In one evening, Stadnik delivered Ontario. 3 months later, Operation Springtime took him down, and he was convicted of conspiracy, drug trafficking, and gangsterism, and sentenced to 20 years. But the organization he built kept dominating Canadian organized crime perfectly well without him. The damage Stadnik did was never the bodies. It was the national machine he left behind. Weigh what that December night actually meant. For its entire existence, the Hells Angels had been locked out of Canada's richest province, and Stadnik opened it not with a bombing campaign, but with a business proposition, doubling the club's reach and handing it the biggest drug market in the country in the space of a few hours. It was the single most consequential act of expansion in the history of the Canadian Angels, and it was pulled off not by the warlord fighting in Quebec, but by the quiet strategist almost no one was watching. While the entire country's eyes were fixed on Boucher's war, Stadnik had won a far bigger prize without firing a shot, and that is exactly why he belongs this high on the list. The men who spilled blood grabbed the headlines. The man who drew the map built the empire. And even in defeat, he never broke. In court, Stadnik was described as polite, respectful, and utterly unyielding, refusing to admit he had ever been a Hells Angel or to concede a shred of guilt. The organization he'd built simply kept running without him, dominating Canadian organized crime as smoothly as if he'd never been arrested, the surest proof that his real weapon was never his own hands, but the national machine he'd assembled to outlast every single man who ran it. 10 Maurice Boucher. In March 1985, the Hells Angels executed 5 of their own men and dropped the bodies in a river. Most people who witnessed that level of savagery ran from the club for the rest of their lives. Maurice Boucher saw it and decided he wanted in. That single fact tells you everything about the most dangerous man in the history of Canadian organized crime, a man who looked at an organization willing to slaughter its own family and thought, "That is exactly where I belong." Boucher was born in 1953 and came up hard in Montreal's East End, drifting through petty crime and an armed robbery conviction before a rape conviction sent him to prison. He came out in 1986, knowing exactly where he was going, and joined the Hells Angels that year, earning his full patch on the 1st of May, 1987, 3 days after a rival club leader was shot dead in a bar with no witnesses, a killing widely believed to be Boucher's earn-in. When the Angels created the Nomads, an elite chapter of the country's most dangerous members, answerable to no region. Boucher led it, but power wasn't enough. He wanted total control of Quebec's entire drug trade, a market worth roughly $1 billion a year. Law enforcement described him as a natural-born leader who ruled purely by fear, a man with genuine charisma and organizational skill wrapped around an absolute willingness to kill. That combination is rarer and more dangerous than either quality alone. Plenty of gangsters are violent, plenty are clever. Boucher was both, and he had the ambition to match, which is why he didn't stay a chapter boss content with his corner. He set out to own everything, and he was prepared to spend as many lives as it took. In 1994, he took his shot and set the province on fire. When Cazetta's rock machine refused to accept Hells Angels' control of the street, Boucher launched the Quebec Biker War, and he ran it with the mind of a general and the moral vacuum of a man who had stopped distinguishing acceptable violence from unacceptable long ago. More than 160 dead, over 300 wounded, car bombs on residential streets. And then the moment that turned the entire country against him. In August 1995, a bomb exploded on a Montreal street, and the shrapnel killed an 11-year-old boy named Daniel Desroches, who was simply playing outside. He was not a target, he was a child, and that dead boy did what years of gangland killings never. Had it made the war real to the public, and it never let Boucher go. This was not a series of hits ordinary people could ignore. It was open warfare in a modern Canadian city, dragging on for the better part of a decade, with bodies turning up week after week and explosions in neighborhoods where families lived. Boucher ran it from the nomads, and beneath him he built an enforcement structure led by men like Gregory Woolly and the Rockers, a machine designed to kill efficiently and constantly until every rival either submitted or died. He wasn't fighting for survival or territory in any ordinary sense. He was fighting for total, undisputed control of a billion-dollar market, and he was willing to burn down the peace of an entire province to get it. The Desroches boy was the price the public finally refused to keep paying the single death, among all the hundreds, that turned Mom Boucher from an untouchable legend into the most hunted man in the country. Then he crossed the line even hardened criminals understood not to cross. He declared war on the state itself, ordering the murders of prison guards Diane Levine, shot dead on her way home from work in June 1997, a second guard gunned down months later, as a deliberate message to the justice system that no informant deal could ever repair. In 1998, a jury acquitted him, and he was carried through the streets on his supporters' shoulders, a man who had beaten the state in open court. That image Mom Boucher hoisted on cheering shoulders outside a Montreal courthouse, untouchable, triumphant, is the high watermark of the Hells Angels' war on Canada. He had murdered prison guards to intimidate the justice system and then beaten that same justice system in front of the cameras. For a moment, he was the most powerful criminal in the country's history, a man who had declared war on the state and appeared to have won, and every gangster in Canada saw exactly what was possible. But the acquittal rested partly on the testimony of a shooter-turned-witness, and the Crown did not give up. They took the case back, and this time they had more. But the 11-year-old boy had already changed everything. In 2001, Operation Springtime struck with the full backing of an outraged public and the inside intelligence of Danny Kane. And in 2002, Boucher was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and given 3 life sentences. He was sent to Canada's only supermax prison, placed in isolation, and even there kept ordering killings, convicted again in 2018 of conspiring to murder a rival. He died of throat cancer behind those walls in July 2022 at 69, disowned by the club he'd bled for. There was no biker funeral for Mom Boucher. Sit with that 2018 conviction for a second, because it is the truest measure of the man. Isolated, watched around the clock, in the deepest hole the Canadian system has, with nothing left to gain and no chance of release, Boucher was still reaching out through the walls to try to have a man killed. Violence wasn't a tool he used to get ahead. It was the language he thought in, the only way he knew how to answer the world, all the way to the end. The war he ran forced the Canadian government to write entirely new organized crime laws just to fight what he had built, changing the country's legal landscape permanently. He killed for the badge, ruled by fear, and declared war on a nation, and the machine he helped forge outlived him. exactly as it outlived every other man on this list. One country, a handful of men, more than 160 dead, 5 of them executed by their own brothers and sunk in a river, one of them an 11-year-old boy on a sidewalk. The founder was shot in a bar. The assassin died a broken pariah. The informant died in a locked garage. The rival became the boss. The bridge builder was shot beside his newborn. One architect vanished and was never found. Another built a national empire from a scarred body and watched it thrive without him. And the warlord died in a cell while the organization he helped forge grew stronger than it had ever been. That is the thing almost nobody understands about the Hells Angels in Canada. It was never really about any single man, no matter how dangerous. It was built to survive, all of them to absorb its own wars, its own traitors, even its own enemies, and keep running. Every name on this list is dead, imprisoned, or a fugitive. The club is still here. So here's the question worth sitting with. Of all these men, the founder, the assassins, the informant, the strategist, the boss who murdered guards to frighten a nation, which one do you think did the most lasting damage? The ones who spilled the blood, or the quiet builders who made sure the machine would outlast every last one of them? Drop where you land in the comments and tell me which of these 10 you'd never heard of before. And if you want the next story like this one, the kind where the truth cuts deeper than any fiction, subscribe and stay for the ride.